you've spent any time in the unschooling community, you've probably noticed that certain questions come up again and again. The circumstances change. The ages of the children change. When you're in our Zoom community calls, but every week or so, someone asks something that nearly every parent in the room is nodding in recognition. A mom might say, "My daughter is 9 and still isn't reading the way my friend's child is." Or another parent wonders if they should be doing more math because their son doesn't seem interested in it at all. Sometimes it's the parent of a teenager who feels like everyone else's kids have plans for college or a career while theirs is happily immersed in art, gaming, or spending time with friends. The conversation always starts with a specific worry, but it rarely stays there. Before long, someone else admits they've wondered the same thing. Another parent shares that they had exactly the same fear a few years ago. Someone whose children are grown offers a little perspective that everyone in the room seems to need. You can almost feel the relief when parents realize they aren't the only one carrying around these worries. Underneath every one of those conversations is the same question. Is my child behind? I understand why that question has so much power. Even after years of unschooling, it can be easily pulled into comparing our children to what everyone else seems to be doing. Because most of us have spent our entire childhood and much of our adulthood being taught that learning follows a schedule. Reading belongs here. Math belongs there. High school is followed by college, and adulthood begins somewhere right after that. So those timelines become part of the air we breathe. We don't even notice them until our child steps outside them. That's why this question is so common among unschooling parents. We may have intentionally walked away from school, but many of us are still carrying around those school expectations. We believe children learn differently, right up until our own child doesn't match the pace of the children around us. Then suddenly we're searching online for things like, is my child behind? Or wondering if we've somehow missed something important. The longer I work with unschooling families, the more I've come to believe that this question deserves a different answer than most parenting advice offers. Before we ask whether a child is behind, we need to ask something even more fundamental. Behind whom? Because that one question changes everything. It's worth asking the question that we rarely stop to consider. Who decided what on track looks like? The answer isn't child development. It's school. Schools have to educate large groups of children at the same time, so they organize learning into grade levels and decide what will be taught each year. It's a practical solution to managing classrooms full of 20 or 30 kids. There has to be a sequence, a curriculum, and a way to know whether their class is ready to move on. The system works okay for schools, but it's easy to forget it was designed to organize education, not to describe how every child naturally learns. Once you step outside school, you begin to notice that learning is much less predictable than those timelines suggest. A child who has shown little interest in reading may suddenly devour books after discovering a topic that they love. A teenager who has avoided formal math might eagerly learn it because they want to build something or start a business or solve a real problem. The timeline didn't change. The purpose did. That's why I hesitate to ask if a child is behind. The question assumes that there's one correct path that every child should be following. And after all these years of working with unschooling families, I don't believe that's true. I think there are as many learning timelines as there are children. Most parents aren't actually worried about the learning itself. They're worried about how their child's learning compares to school. Once you recognize that distinction, it becomes much easier to trust your child in the unschooling journey because children don't learn on timelines. And what I've seen is that the story a parent is telling themselves today is rarely the story they're telling themselves a few years down the road. A parent may come into the community because their 10-year-old still isn't reading. They've tried all the things they thought they were supposed to try. And every conversation with well-meaning relatives leaves them wondering if they're making a terrible mistake. Then, almost unexpectedly, their child discovers a topic that they can't get enough of. Maybe it's fantasy novels connected to a favorite game. Maybe it's a book about reptiles or space or trains. Maybe it's online communities where reading has become the key to participating. The child hasn't changed. Reading finally has a purpose. I've seen the same thing with math. A child who avoids worksheets for years suddenly begins doubling recipes or comparing prices or calculating discounts or figuring out how much money it's going to take to save up for something they want. Another discovers woodworking or coding and game design and realizes that math is simply one of the tools they need to bring an idea to life. The same pattern often shows up during the teenage years. Parents worry because their teen doesn't have a clear plan, while everyone else seems to be focused on that college application and their career goals. And from the outside, it can look like they're drifting. In reality, many are doing exactly what adolescents have always done, exploring interests, trying new things, and slowly discovering what matters to them. Sometimes that exploration leads to video editing or programming or veterinary medicine or entrepreneurship or careers that they never would have even imagined at 15. And after watching this happen again and again, I've stopped thinking of these stories as exceptions. They're what learning looks like when children are trusted. Children don't learn because the calendar says it's time. They learn when something becomes meaningful enough to make the effort worthwhile. So that's why I encourage parents to zoom out whenever they're worried about a learning timeline. Childhood isn't a race made up of isolated milestones. It's a long story, and judging it by a simple chapter almost always leads to the wrong conclusion. When you stop watching the calendar so closely, something remarkable happens. You start watching your child instead. Learning doesn't always announce itself. In school, it's easy to recognize. A worksheet gets completed, a quiz comes home, a grade goes down in the grade book. Progress is visible because the system is designed to measure it. Real life isn't nearly that tidy. Instead of asking, what did my child learn today? Unschooling encourages us to ask a different question. What is my child engaged in? And what are they learning because they're engaged? Sometimes the answer is obvious. A child who spends hours building in Minecraft isn't just playing a game. They're solving problems, collaborating with friends, planning projects, managing resources, and reading because they want to understand something better. Sometimes it's less obvious. A long conversation over breakfast can turn into an afternoon researching volcanoes or ancient Egypt or how airplanes stay in the air. A child who spends weeks drawing isn't just doodling. They're developing observation and persistence, creativity, and the ability to improve through practice. The more you spend time with other unschooling families, the more you notice that learning is woven into ordinary life. It happens through conversations and hobbies and projects, friendships, play, curiosity. It's messy. It's interconnected. And because it isn't divided into subjects and class periods, it can be surprisingly easy to overlook. One of the biggest mindset shifts in unschooling is learning to recognize growth instead of looking for schoolwork. When you start paying attention to the questions your child asks, the problems they solve, the interests they pursue, and the confidence they're building, you begin to realize something important. Learning has been happening all along. So, if you found the blog or the podcast or the video because you searched, "Is my child behind?" you were probably hoping for a simple answer. I wish there was one. What I can tell you is that different doesn't automatically mean behind. Those are two very different ideas, and learning to separate them is one of the most important mindset shifts an unschooling parent can make. The truth is, no one can tell you from a child's age alone whether they're thriving. A list of milestones doesn't tell us whether they're curious, engaged, growing in confidence, developing meaningful relationships, or discovering who they are. It only tells us whether they match the timeline that was created in school. Before assuming your child is behind, I think it's helpful to separate two questions before they get tangled up together. Is my child following the same timeline as children in school? Or is my child continuing to grow? Those questions don't always have the same answer. One asks how your child compares to a system. The other asks you to really see your child in front of you. For unschooling families, I think that's almost always the better place to begin. So at some point, every unschooling parent has to decide what they're going to use as their measuring stick. If it's school, you'll almost always find a reason to worry. There will always be another benchmark your child hasn't reached, another subject they haven't explored, another child who seems further ahead. Comparison has a way of moving that finish line. Another important shift in unschooling isn't changing how we teach. It's changing how we define success. Instead of asking, is my child behind? I want to encourage you to ask some different questions. Like, is my child growing? Not just academically, but as a person. Are they becoming more confident, more resilient, more independent? Are they learning from mistakes instead of fearing them? Is my child curious? Curiosity is one of the clearest signs that learning is alive. Children who ask questions, explore ideas, follow interests, and make connections are already doing the work of lifelong learning, even if it doesn't look like a traditional lesson. Another question to ask is our relationship strong? When children know they can come to us with their questions, their struggles, their dreams without fear of judgment, we've created something far more valuable than perfect grades. We've created a safe place to grow. Or does my child know how to solve problems? Because life is rarely going to hand you a worksheet with one correct answer. Whether it's learning a new skill, navigating a friendship, fixing something they broke, or adapting when plans change, problem solving is one of the most valuable abilities a child can develop. When I look at the grown unschoolers, those are the qualities that I notice first. They know how to learn. They've spent their lives learning. They know how to seek out information, ask for help, adapt when something isn't working, and trust themselves to figure things out. That's a very different measure of success than school offers. But I think it's more meaningful. So the next time you catch yourself wondering whether your child is behind, pause before reaching for someone else's timeline. Look at that child in front of you. Notice who they're becoming, not just what they know today. Because the goal of unschooling was never to recreate school at home. The goal was to raise capable, curious, confident human beings. And that's a journey that can't be measured by grade levels or calendars. So maybe your child isn't behind. Maybe they're exactly where they need to be to become the person they were meant to become. But you don't have to figure this out alone. Because one of the hardest things about unschooling isn't explaining your choices to other people. And that can be tough. It's carrying the weight of every decision by yourself. If you've ever found yourself wondering, is my child behind? Or lying awake trying to decide whether to wait or intervene or simply trust the process, you're exactly the kind of parent that we built the Creating Confidence community for. Inside this community, these are the conversations that we're having throughout the week. Parents asking questions about reading and math and teens, motivation, evaluations, and learning differences. We talk through real situations together and learn from families who have walked this path before. We can help one another separate fear from what we're actually seeing in children. You don't have to navigate those questions alone. You can even come and spend a week with us and see if it's a good fit. I'll leave a link for you in the description. Let's help you get onto some steadier ground with this. Happy unschooling, and I'll see you next time.